Okay, I'm going to briefly introduce the event before it officially starts. So welcome everyone and welcome back if you were with us for the board game. We are now about to begin the second event of the day, which is the book launch of AA's latest publication titled Experiments in Care and Collective Disobedience. So I do recognize a few new faces, so I want to make another round of introduction. First of all, my name is Dot. I work as the Associate Curator at Easy Contemporary. We are the UK's only non-profit art centre, and we work to increase the visibility of contemporary art practices from the East and Southeast Asian communities and their diasporas. And today our two events with AAA, Asia-Art-Activism, is part of our current exhibition upstairs titled Practice Till We Meet. Curated by Hanlu Zhang, the exhibition explores diasporic experiences, the conditions of migration, and the challenges and actions taken to create a just life in a new place. As one of the participating collective in the exhibition, Asia-Art-Activism is an interdisciplinary, intergenerational network of artists, curators, and academics founded in London in 2018. Investigating concepts relating to Asia, art, and activism in the UK, expanding a conversation around Asia as a contested paradigm and lived transnational narratives of its diasporas, migrant and resident communities. The network highlights lesser-known accounts of Asian artists and activists in the UK and questions esea invisibility within institutional narratives of British art and politics. So today we're delighted to host this book launch together with the Roundtable discussion extended from the topics included in this publication. I'm going to briefly introduce this publication. So it's edited by Dr. Joanna Wolfath and Jael Kwan of Asia-Art-Activism. The publication contains writing by leading academics, artists, curators, and researchers who address urgent questions on the following: the complexities of UK Black/Asian race relations and migration in parallel with global Black/Asia political entanglements and tensions, and on the rise of anti-Asian/migrant sentiments in the UK in relation to the hostile environment and the weaponization of the COVID-19 pandemic. Across 18 discursive and creative pieces, the contributing writers also explore where Asia is situated within the institutional narrative of British art and the nature of transnational solidarity, and how diaspora can work as a lens to inform and inflect cultural activities. Today's roundtable will be moderated by Annie. Annie is an independent curator and researcher based in London and working between the UK, Europe, and Asia. Her exhibition-making, programming, publication, and teaching practice is located at the intersection of contemporary art, cultural, and pedagogical activism, with an interest in archives, feminist, queer, and alternative histories and knowledges, collective practice, and solidarity. She leads Asia-Art-Activism, which I reintroduced before, and contributes to various publications as a writer or co-editor. And at the same time, we're delighted to have two special speakers joining the roundtable. First of all, we have Clare. Clare Chun-yu is an artist, filmmaker. Her recent completed practice-based fine art PhD reinterpreted English chinoiserie from a post-colonial and personal/Taiwanese perspective. Outside of the PhD, she has been exploring the Chinese diaspora based on her familial background. In her practice, she extensively employs oral history and lived experience in the form of fiction and non-fiction to challenge the grand narratives. Clare is a professional mentor at University of Arts London and has lectured at Manchester School of Art. Her films have been screened or exhibited in the UK and internationally. And then we have Kai. Kai Xing-Tan is an award-winning artist, curator, academic, consultant, agitator, changemaker, volunteer, and gatecrasher. Kai's work seeks to catalyze conversations and actions for a more equitable and creative future. mobilizing artistic and artful processes to develop new and meaningful connections in a playful way across disciplinary / cultural / geopolitical / sectoral / class and other normative divides, as well as diverse / divergent bodies and bodies of knowledge. Kai generates novel insights and urgent questions. So let's welcome the three speakers. Now pass the mic.
I think I'm just going to start by saying thank you so much to Dot. I think we began a conversation before even meeting in person, which is not untypical, I think, over the last 2 years for many of us. I think because Dot has delivered this wonderful intro, I think I might give it a little bit of the background instead, the sort of what's happening behind the scenes. But really do want to give a shout out to esea Contemporary because they've been doing a lot of work to relaunch, and they've been incredibly welcoming and supportive of our Kickstarter. Anyone who's run a Kickstarter before will know, like, you don't want to do one again very soon. It's taken a lot of effort to put the book together. So we want to thank Xiaowen and Dot for being very welcoming, and also Hanlu for inviting us. So we're really pleased to be part of the conversation and very happy to be here and for all the team support today. Great snacks, thank you, that makes a difference. As Dot mentioned, I am an independent curator and researcher. So in some way, this conversation hinges me to the research network AA, Asia-Art-Activism, that was launched in 2018. But my own practice has sort of evolved since 2012, 2013 around questions of movement, migration, and then slowly, as I'm also rediscovering my own identity, a resurgence of interest in Asian diaspora. What does it mean to reconnect back to home? And all of these things sort of converge together in the result of this project. And the thing about Asia-Art-Activism is that when it was first launched, it was done in this way where we were not intending to form, but there was an opportunity to be a group to get some space at Raven Row. So, you know, with that as an incentive in London where space is so precious, it was a scramble. It was literally done in 2 or 3 days. I just made this website and was like, oh, look, here we're a group, you know, give us some space. And they did. And when they did, then that became the question of what are we actually, right? So it really was formed in this way where we thought, oh, here's an experimental project that we didn't have to create all these decided outcomes for funding. So here's an opportunity to really just experiment, you know, and let this sort of notion of emergence unfold. What would happen if we came together? And it was meant to be only a 1-year experimental project. And of course then, you know, we were doing things, more opportunities came, people started to collaborate, and then the pandemic hit. And, you know, and Raven Row was very kind to extend our lease, even though we were only partially in and out due to the lockdowns and so on. But for AA, there wasn't a question. We had to hold on to each other during a time when everyone was socially isolated and scared, and it really hit home at that time that if you're diasporic, you're not only worried about yourself here, you're worried about other people elsewhere and constantly wondering how to reach out, how to connect, right? So that became really clear across the 2 years, and we were in some ways forced to hold on to each other. And so I think came last year where us, along with London, had to shift back to this notion of returning when we don't even know what returning really means in this post-Brexit, post-pandemic era, right? So this is the climate of which we work. But alongside that, I'm really pleased to have today with me Syng and Clare Liu. And our engagements also were in the same way, very kind of diasporic and tangled, because Syng and I worked together in 2015, you know, because we have this connection even back then, and then through another project that I ran also with my co-director Alessandra Cinetti, and we did something for Singapore Tourism Board as well back in 2015. Yeah. So this is like a bit of a history of always knowing that we were migrant in London and the UK, and then Clare and I think met in 2016 at GACS, which was also again about global Asia. Yeah. So there's these dialogues that have unfolded across time, but I knew that both of them have been situated here, and they have also been part of witnessing what's been changing and shifting in this community in the UK. So I thought it would be really interesting for us to have a conversation together. So this is just to give you a little background of why we're here. Last point is that I think for us, this publication has been a long time unfolding. I think for all of you who work in publications, and I know many of you do, you know how much sweat and tears goes into it. And then also just want to give a shout out to Yali, who was incredible during the Kickstarter campaign to like keep pushing it forward, and the generosity of the other members who also donated things for perks. So it was a real community effort to get us to the point, because our printing cost post-Brexit, thank you Brexit, shot up by 1,600 quid just because of postage and papers and printing, and yeah, it was not fun, thank you. But here we are, we've got a publication, and it's a little bit of a legacy, it's a bit of reflection, it's a little bit of holding space for multiple practices and perspectives. And you know, as we will talk more about it, when you have so many people from different diasporas all coming together with different needs, different agendas, yes, different aims, you know, it's potent for possibility, but also ripe for trouble, right? So that's something that also is what community is, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But first, I'd like to invite Kai to come and share a bit about her practice. And,
I want to thank the organizers, and of course I want to thank Annie for having me here. My name is Kai, so I migrated up to sunny Manchester 3.5 years ago now, because I got tired of flip-flops and tropical weather from Syng. No, but before that I was in London, so but I'm really happy to be here, really excited about the publication. It looks amazing, and it's really a very timely moment for us to have such a book, such a handbook, and such a jumping board for people to kind of get on with a lot of the action that needs doing. So I'm really pleased to be here, and I thought by way of introduction I could just share a 30-second film. Yeah. How to thrive in 2050. Are you crossed at the injustices of the world? Fed up at how normative standards have been substandard? Stop taking things lying down. Exercise your right to kick up a storm. Hi, I'm Kai. I'm a chimera octopussy, infused by ancient wisdom to reconnect the body with mind, soul with soul, the common with the cosmic. I'm hyperactive. I won't sit still, and I'm restless for change. 2050 is only one generation away, so we're running out of time. Slash your safety harnesses, put on your tinted goggles. Join me in 8 tentacular workouts for a tantalizing future. Stretch your imagination, reimagine a future that recenters creativity, diversity, and neurodiversity, celebrating our different brains, minds, beings, and possibilities. We've got our work cut out. Let's get our hands filthy. Are you ready? So I should add that that's a trailer for a longer, slightly longer film in 8 chapters, 8 tentacles, so 8 chapters. So yeah, so do I stop now and then?
No, tell us more about your work, and maybe then you can pass it on to Claire.
Okay, sure. Yeah, a lot of my current work is around thinking about the future and also thinking about leadership, and which is also why I'm really interested in hearing about Annie's project. I've always been following Annie's work, obviously, but also a lot of my current work is about thinking about people on the margins, etc., and how do we kind of flip things around. In this film there's mention of neurodiversity, which is a large aspect of my work, and so the kind of Chinese aspect is one dimension of something that I do take on, but it's not the kind of overarching kind of framework that I use, because I do, as it is, have a lot of labels to work with. So I like to kind of engage with them and irritate them and trouble a lot of the labels. So leadership is just another label that I'm now super interested in, because for a lot of people it's a really bad word. It's toxic, right? I mean, when we think about leaders or leadership, we're thinking about Peppa Pig's pandemonium at 10 Downing Street. We're thinking about Putin. We're thinking of all the really things that aren't working. You know, how do we get here, etc. But for me, I'm particularly interested in the sort of people who are talking about leadership, and the people who are talking about leadership are talking also about creativity, especially in the era of technology, AI, etc. And interestingly, the people who should be part of the conversation are always not in the same room or at the same table to begin with. So artists are not in that space. People in the margins are innovative and they have all the life hacks because the system isn't built for us. But we are also not in the same room, not at the table to talk about leadership. So I'm precisely very keen to kind of be in that space. That's why I talk about myself as a gatecrasher. I do go to parties I'm not invited to, like as if I'm a party animal. But so that's kind of part of the work that I'm doing, and as part of that's part of the reason why I'm in Manchester. I got up here to help to start. I am a program leader for a master's program, and the title is Creative Arts Leadership, and it's starting this year. And the whole idea is about really opening up this idea of what leadership could be. So it's exactly targeting people who don't feel entitled to be part of, who don't feel like they are leaders to begin with. It's about really saying, look, how can we bring artists who have been doing really amazing change-making work on the ground in leadership terms, and to make people outside of this conversation pay more attention to these actions and these tactics. So it's about elevating and celebrating the work of amazing people around myself, and Rudy is here, so sorry to put you on the spot, but Rudy, do you want to raise your hand slightly? Yeah. Sorry. So Rudy, I got to know Rudy through the pandemic. We had an intense online relationship, one of the many intense online relationships I had, but one of the reasons why we got together in terms of meeting online was because of Black Lives Matter, and there was a lot of discussions and a lot of supposedly what looked like pledges to make things better, to change things, but not really. They were performative. I am at Manchester Metropolitan University, and Rudy is an alumni, so we kind of got talking about the kind of former injustices in higher education institutions like like Manchester Metropolitan and many others, and then I went on to curate a festival, or co-curate, I would say, co-curate a festival with Black colleagues to celebrate Black History Month, and it's the Pan-African PAC 75. It's the Pan-African Congress celebration. What's it called? 75th anniversary of the 1945 Pan-African Congress, and because that Congress took place at where Manchester Metropolitan University stands, and of course it's one of the histories that's been actively erased. So I was working with Black colleagues to help to kind of put together a set of 18 activities, etc. And Rudy was important in that because Rudy was teaching me a lot about Manchester, because I'm not native here in Manchester, and of course also teaching me about Black history, teaching me about the diaspora, teaching me about the Pan-Africanness, opening my eyes to Afrofuturism. So someone like Rudy has been instrumental to my thinking, and so coming up with a course and using my privilege to come up with the course, etc., is kind of part of the work that I'm doing in terms of trying to say, look, formalize, to try to formalize things and say, look, this is something we need to pay attention to. And I think Annie used the word holding the space, and I think that's a good term to kind of describe. Is that too much?
No, that's brilliant. That's a really good, a lot to work with.
I don't know how much you wanted. I just kind of
that's on. Great. That's tons to work with. So maybe we could get Claire to jump in, and maybe I can talk a little bit of work, and then we'll come up with.
Thank you, Kai, for your very interesting introduction to what you have been up to. So, really looking forward to reading the book properly. I had a read of it last week when I came to visit the exhibition upstairs, which is a very enriching experience. So, Annie just mentioned that previously we were engaged in an event together in London. So I just dug out my CV on my website. So it was back in 2018 in the pre-pandemic paradise. So we were part of this symposium called Here, There, East and Southeast Asia Diasporic Act at Central St. Martin's. And I believe it was also a collaboration between Central St. Martin's and Asia Pacific American Institute at New York University. So it was a brilliant event where artists, including myself, spoke about our practice in relation to diaspora. And I remember at that time I shared my films about my family's experience of migrating over from mainland China to Taiwan at the end of the Second World War with the nationalists. So that was in the beginning of my artist practice that I started in the UK. So I came here 11 years ago, having not done art before, so I started everything here. So I spent quite a few years exploring my family's experience of moving over from China, but also from Indonesia. So my father's side is in Indonesia. Is it a bit loud? Is in Indonesia. So he came over when the communist purge happened decades ago. So he moved over as a child, basically as a refugee, but he probably wasn't recognized as a refugee. So in my several artist moving image work, I explore all this historical context, mixing with my collection of oral history and lived experience of people I know from my family, and also people I got to know later on in the UK. And then I realized that there's this very interesting, almost like a mirror effect. If you look at the nationalist new migrants, like my mother's family in Taiwan, and then the Chinese people staying in China, but then their relatives left for Taiwan. If you put the two experiences together, you get a complete story, you know. And I also explored Benedict Anderson's notion of imagined community. So what was the imagined community here between China and Taiwan over 38 years? Because in Taiwan we had martial law for 38 years. And there was no communication, no post, no telephone, no internet, of course. So people couldn't travel over, and then everything was imagined. And then later on through the mass communication, the mass media. So that's my previous work. And then 5 years ago, I moved to Manchester from London to do my practice-based fine art PhD here at MMU, also where Kai works. So in my PhD, which I just finished, I explore English chinoiserie. So chinoiserie was the 18th century craft movement in Europe, also in the UK, that mimicked Chinese craft motifs, such as the blue and white porcelain. So that's the most kind of distinctive British chinoiserie style. So we call it the willow pattern. So in my PhD, I review English chinoiserie from a post-colonial and personal and Taiwanese and also diasporic perspective. Maybe we can show the clip now. Yeah, it's about time.
To me, chinoiserie is comically outlandish and bizarrely beautiful. As a Taiwanese person at large, I can't help but question Chineseness in terms of identity and representation.
Somehow, my Manchurian identity was merely a cultural curiosity and no longer a political problem. The sole problem was to grapple with this impossible life of mine whilst I was alive.
The China I know is an aesthetic entity. The imageries of the people, landscape and industries never fail to serve as a fertile source of imagination and fantasy.
My celestial empire and people certainly do not go about as inspiration for your domestic decorations scheme in the name of taste. Our existence is solely for our own purpose, for a celestial purpose.
Yeah, so this is the second film from my newly completed finished PhD. So in my research and practice, I look at English chinoiserie in relation to colonialism. So Britain colonized Hong Kong in the mid-19th century, but chinoiserie was most popular in the 18th century. So there's a kind of a time gap, and therefore reviewing English chinoiserie from a post-colonial perspective becomes a problem of how to review pre-colonial contact in this context, but in relation to colonialism. So in my PhD, it was really important for me to be experimental and to be open-ended about how to approach this subject matter, because colonization happened actually later on. So I came up with this idea to have multiple narratives through making fiction films. So I have multiple people from the Chinese side and also from the British side. So from the British side, I have historical people from the manor houses where I filmed these works. And from the Chinese side, I have various film characters. So I have Qianlong, the Chinese emperor, who's kind of like the Chinese equivalent of Queen Victoria, who conquered many areas and put together into this massive empire or kingdom. So I have Qianlong and also Ang. So when I was living in Taipei, where I grew up in Taiwan, I lived in a very modest flat in a building with my parents, and there was this very elderly lady downstairs. I was about 5 or 7, and she was in her 80s. And then my parents used to visit her downstairs, especially my mother, who was and still is obsessed with jewelry. And then that grandmother had a lot of jade and furniture from the Qing dynasty, because she was actually a distant cousin of the last Chinese emperor, Pu Yi. And then she actually fled the Second World War with the nationalists to Taiwan and ended up downstairs. And then when I look back at this part of history, here as an artist, I thought it's incredible that you escape a war with the people who had overthrown your family's business / dynasty, and then become this multiple migrant, and how would she explore Chineseness herself? What would be her perspective if she looked at English chinoiserie? So I also have her as my film character, and also myself as the only living person. So we, the three people from the Chinese side and the historical people from the British side, have these long conversations and monologues of each other, and then we explore what Chineseness as a visual language and also as an identity means to us, informed by our real lived experience. So I see my research and practice, such as this film, as part of the bigger project of reviewing the history in relation to colonialism, which I learned also only in this country, because in Taiwan we don't talk about post-colonialism. The Japanese culture and colonization of Taiwan is part of our daily culture, but we don't question it. I've only learned about the post-colonial business, so to speak, in the UK as a migrant myself. So as time goes by, I've just finished my PhD a few months ago, I've been realizing on a daily basis that my PhD context is actually me participating in British life and culture and art and academic research as a migrant. So it's kind of me combining my previous focus on exploring diaspora and the Chinese diaspora, and also this newly introduced idea of post-colonial theory put together. and then in this context, I explore English nursery. Yeah, so that's what I have been up to.
Okay, thank you so much, Claire.
I'll throw the ball at you.
Yeah. No, come, let's just have a chat over all these really rich ideas and.
Do you want to sit in the center?
No, not really.
Is it because I'm the shortest?
No, that's where we get a nice little conversation angle going. Yeah. I was just so taken. Firstly, thank you so much. You've both been doing incredible work and, exploring histories, but also the present, and also engaging with difficulties, right? These are challenging topics, challenging times, and you're making it work. So thank you so much for your labor. And also thank you so much for being here and agreeing to be in this conversation. I was just listening to you both and firstly feeling so energized, thinking, yes, you guys are doing the work, that's always so good, because doing the work is tiring, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so when you see other people doing the work, you feel like, okay, I can carry on a little bit, So that's a good rhythm, thank you. I first was really taken about what you're saying about leadership, also that you have been not necessarily just working under one framework or label of Asianness, but also investigating through your practice this other label that's emerged, neurodivergence. Yeah. And can you talk a little about what that means for you intersectionally to bring those two together? And I know you've been doing work also with King's Institute, King's College, and how that has unfolded first. Yeah.
First of all, labels are always problematic, aren't they? As I'm not the first one to make that observation. But it's an interesting one. So the neurodiversity, as you may know, is about the difference. In a nutshell, it's like the acknowledgement and also perhaps celebration about diversity of different brains, different beings, different minds, different ways of processing the world. And specifically the kind of traditional remit will be including people who are autistic, people who are dyslexic, etc. But of course a lot of these terms are highly pathologized and medicalized, and a lot of people have a lot of problems with these terms, including myself. But so one of the kind of ways to kind of think about that is the presence of different ways to process the world. That's kind of the broad kind of definition that I kind of use. But of course, the person who started it, Judy Singer, she was very much thinking about it aligned with biodiversity, which I think is really powerful and so pertinent today. But often we forget about that because often then people talk about neurodiversity in terms of identity, politics, etc., or so-called culture wars, etc. But of course, a lot of us like to keep kind of bringing the discussion back to systemic oppression, etc., which is kind of part of my work. But part of my work also is about aligning so-called deficits or disorders, etc., into assets and kind of flipping things around. But that's also part of what I always do as an artist anyway. So when I discovered that I was actually not just different, but like medically different, I was like, okay, what do I do with that information? Am I going to just take that line down? No, I'm going to interrogate that. So the work that you were referring to at King's College London was kind of part of that process of trying to unpack that. Like, I'm not just going to stick another label to myself. I need to kind of find out more. So I became the first artist in residence at it's another mouthful, SGDP, Social Genetic Developmental Psychiatry Centre at King's College London, and I was in conversation with a psychiatrist to find out exactly why people like them think about myself as abnormal, and that's a term they do use as part of their research. So that's the kind of neurodiversity part, and the reason why I say kind of I question that amongst other labels is because I came very late to that label. Like, I've been fully formed, actually not fully formed at all. I'm like I'm kind of disintegrating as we speak. But like, I've been around for a while, and when like a lot of people, these labels come on quite late because it's quite recent kind of development in terms of the medical side of things. So when that label was kind of, when I became associated with that label, I just thought, okay, this is something I need to kind of unpick. But then back to your question about Chineseness, etc. Is that the term you use? Chineseness?
Or Asianness?
Asianness, yeah. Those are interesting terms because, of course, originally I come from Singapore, which is also not, which is not my associate I align myself with. I hardly ever. Do I ever? No, I don't. I don't think I describe myself as a. Do you? Do you call yourself? Sorry, I assume you can read my mind. I don't describe myself as a Singaporean. Yeah, that sounds weird. Although I do still have the passport, because, but I don't describe myself as that. But like you and like many people on the move, we kind of come to terms with it, or we have to kind of confront that when we are kind of displaced, when we are on the move and being outside of our kind of natural, I would say unnatural habitat, because there's nothing natural about.
I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because whether you choose to call yourself something or not, it's often applied to you regardless of your preference.
Yeah, but of course having choice is a privilege too. It's an immense privilege. I mean, often you are read before you enter space and your name, etc. So yeah, so labels are interesting, and of course a lot of my work is also about kind of questioning those labels and kind of this a lot of work of resistance is about reclaiming terms, questioning those words or labels. And for me, because also I'm dyslexic, or I've been told I am dyslexic, a lot of my work is also involving wordplay, as you saw in that film, about using puns, using the English language, although it is my mother tongue. Sorry, I will stop talking using a lot of inverted commas, but but a lot of my
problematizing language as you speak.
Yeah. So never ever taking it as neutral, never ever taking things as a given, and always kind of trying to unpick that. And yeah, I'm currently writing 3 books, working on 3 books, and it's like, it's a nightmare.
Language has many tentacles that won't be.
Absolutely. But it's fascinating, and so it's that kind of fascinating space of how. Yeah,
I think what you've also been working on, which you've maybe not claiming that, but I actually think that by coming out as neurodivergent and also with your particular identity at that moment that you're working with. It's also really brave, because quite often in the Asian community we have to, maybe we're so conditioned to do that model minority thing, right?
Oh yeah,
you have to be the exceptional, you have to work harder to achieve something. And even within Asian society, however modern, you know, we're very slow to accept destigmatization of various sort of conditions that are normalized, right? So even depression, even mental health, it's really difficult for a more traditional society to understand that. So also neurodivergence is something that's quite difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it's an interesting point, but also I think the more I think about it, I also don't have traditional concepts of what boundaries are. So often I break boundaries and I'm told, oh, you're doing something funky. And I'm like, oh, am I? Like even before the neurodivergence or the disability/neurodiversity stuff coming in late, very, very late in my life. Before that, when I was showing films in different contexts, I was in film festivals, etc., different contexts, and people would say, oh, why are you doing this? And I didn't even know it was not on. I'm not supposed to do that. So I've always had a very fraught but interesting relationship with boundaries and borders, which are prescribed. And that's why I use the word tentacular. It's about because the structure as it is often is made by, for, with people outside of the system, then it doesn't quite work for you. Then how do you make connections? So people talk about the chosen family, people talk about finding your own communities and creating solidarity. And for me, the way I think about it, or the way I kind of picture it, is to have tentacles everywhere and to kind of cut across the kind of fixed structures and to make to cross boundaries across disciplines. That's why when you did that, sorry to make you read that long sentence dot when you're introducing me, the slash culture slash disciplines, but that's kind of a lot of what my work is like, to kind of connect across kind of fixed boundaries of knowledges, fixed boundaries of what we are supposed to be, and to kind of use tentacles to kind of link things around across different bodies, and also linking with animals. So there are lots of animals.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let's go with hybridity. I think really what resonates with what you're saying is how difficult it is with labels, and labels also being part of our struggle with terminology, both in institutional terminology, in political terminology, in language. You know, I remember attending a very long day on post-colonialism, and the roundup panel was really how, you know, is the post really post, and should we have a post linked to colonial? Is post-colonial really a useful word after all, because we're not really post yet? And I thought, oh my God, we started there and we still came back there at the end of the day, you know? So, and I'm raising this also because I think one of the things that we are in the moment of questioning is how viable, how important is the issue of representation, right? Because representation inevitably tends to operate through labels, terminology, language, right? So already, like, my Instagram was blowing up with like all the gorgeous photo of Asian people in Karl Lagerfeld inspired outfits at the Met Gala, and I was like, I don't know how to feel about this, because great to see, you know,
and of course he's a misogynist, he's a homophobe, etc.
Yeah, he's such a problematic character, but it's so great to see, you know, Asian cultural workers being celebrated, but then you've got this sort of weird turnaround. How does that work together? So that, you know, is something that I've really been struggling with, this notion of representation, which then plays out in how inclusive are we, or how diverse are we, because it becomes a bit of a checkbox, right? Have we got enough this, you know, is a kind of United Benetton curatorial methodology, but it doesn't always work, right? So we keep hitting up against this. And here I also wanted to maybe think about what you were talking about, Claire. I love this notion of imagined conversations across time, across space. It just gives us so much probability of rethinking where our lineages lie, possible lineages, and also possible futures then, like this fictionalizing, the speculative moment of pushing past the pathways that were designed for us, right? And I think I say this because I'm so aware that when we are using our passports, we are told which lane to go into, right? When we make grant applications, which tick box, which category. And most irritatingly, if this is recorded, please don't play for Arts Council. The feedback of like, who is your community? How are you going to reach out to them? And I kept thinking, if I was a British white artist, would they ask me, how am I going to reach my British white community?
Yeah.
So
because that's assumed to be the norm.
The broad community. So community, which is such a precious word, has now been also utilized as a way to silo us from each other, right? So that's also really troubling, because if we're working on Asia or Chineseness, it becomes, is it this form of it? Is it this form of it? Is it reaching out? And it becomes as, mechanical as saying, do you then have a Filipino art historian curator working on Filipino contemporary art? It's really limited.
I bet there's a formula somewhere.
Can I chip in something at this point? Because I just mentioned that I just finished my PhD on reinterpreting English nursery, and after I submit my thesis, my supervisors really struggled to nominate whom to examine my PhD, because they thought they had to find someone of Chinese heritage. And we tried really hard. We tried to create a list, and we found almost no one. And then one of my supervisors came up with the idea that there's Kai in our department. I'm going to ask her for recommendation.
Do you know, I actually said something, I think I said something rude when I was approached.
So they reach out to you.
So it's the laziest thing ever. Sorry, sorry to interrupt. Go on.
Yes, and then we're almost like celebratory already when the idea was brought up in our supervisory meetings. Yes, there is a solution, because we have someone that looks a bit ethnic Chinese in our department. Ethnic is my word. And then so they reach out to you, you mention someone, and then that's the deal. So that's how my PhD finished smoothly. But then that really tells us identity and representation are from inside to outside, but outside to inside as well. And how we negotiate this kind of to and fro is quite an art itself. And how to explore this within our art practice is another art. And how we approach it. And you mentioned this kind of tokenism and kind of labeling. Yeah. So I've been told a really beautiful an analogy, I would say. So some people think Buddhism is a great thing, but then it's always wrapped with the culture. So for some people, they are interested in Asian culture, but they are not really interested in Buddhism. But how to separate the two? And then someone says, but Buddhism is like water, and culture is the cup. If you don't have a cup, you can't have water. But then you need to know what's the cup, what's the water. So the content and the container. Yeah. So I think if we separate the two, it'll be impossible, but then it'll be also exciting to see what's actually there. Yeah.
I think a lot of some of these questions we also struggled with, I think, in AAA, in terms of like, how do we think of representation? And I think one of the things maybe that we were very fortunate, because there was no design. There was no design of like, we have to have how many people from this community or them. It just was like, who's around? Want to join? Come. Like, oh, we're having food. Who wants to eat? Come. Yeah. So it was kind of very ad hoc. Friends of friends that got recommended. Like the various people I knew from the Philippines, when their colleagues came to London, they'll be like, look this person up, and then they'll come to eat, and then that's how it happened. And sometimes I think that was a really interesting shift in my own mind as well, to move beyond this very difficult methodology of representation, which is, I think, I'm coming to think of it as part of a kind of colonial legacy, because it's so much in the way we frame things, like how we conquer and divide and so on. And this more kind of relational mode that's quite difficult to pin down, which requires time, which requires a kind of metabolizing of difference, and also sitting with difference and sitting with conflict, and all these difficult things that are part of relationship building. And these are things maybe we do consciously or unconsciously, but we haven't really thought of it, in formal terms. But we've now seen that play out more in terms of visual arts, like with Documenta last year, to various degrees and so on. So I think this is really interesting as a kind of another push that is happening alongside, structural changes that we want. Of course, we want different posts to be much more affirmative in terms of the way that they are positioned, but at the same time, there's something relational that moves beyond just about having, one Black curator, one Asian curator, and so on. Yeah.
I love your term, metabolizing difference. Is that yours?
I think everyone metabolizes, so I'm not going to.
I've written it down. I love it because it's about energy. It's about the body in connection with the world. And you're right, there is that notion of a relational approach now, and like people are talking about, climate change, etc. And people in theory are talking about new materialism. I think that's the term. Yeah, linking back to nature. But in my a lot of non-Western cultures, non-Western ontologies already have made that link way back. So in my film, I use Taoism, Chinese Taoism, so it's about the body and mind. So we already solved the Cartesian problem, but also by linking it to nature, to environment. So it's already sorted out in that this is a thing. Like the body is not separate. Like everything we do has a consequence. It's worked out already. So it's a relational approach already, as it is, and indigenous culture as well. It's just reading Linda Tuhiwai Smith, who wrote Decolonizing Methodologies, just a really beautifully, powerfully written book. And what she says was after birth, and I didn't know what after birth. I looked it up because I've never had birth except my own. So I looked it up. So it's like the stuff that comes up with the baby. And so in Maori culture, so Linda Tuhiwai Smith is of Maori. She's a formidable Maori scholar. She talks about the afterbirth as the same word as land. And I thought, because they would bury that afterbirth on the ground. But that practice was banned, of course, by the white settlers. So it's stuff like that, and we were talking about language. That's exactly the sort of thing that I think we need to kind of push to the forefront. The sort of links that are already out there. And I think one of the things you mentioned, and also through Yali's work, you're talking about hidden histories, hidden narratives. A lot of the kind of, I'm not saying that it's to only say that, it's got it all sorted, which is exactly what I sounded like, would be being simplistic as well, being reductionistic or nostalgic, etc. And essentialistic. I'm not saying that, and I don't want to come across as that, but I'm saying that, look, we need to just pay more attention to a lot of the kind of other ways of thinking about the world. And it's absolutely a legacy of colonialism that, like I was mentioning, I was talking about Rudy, because someone like Rudy has helped me to unlearn a lot of what I've learned. I'm of a different generation, and I only learned about Picasso before I learned about people from my own culture who made art. So it's like, whoa, but I like to look into the future. I like to stay hopeful, because hope is the only thing you have. And it's great that I feel lucky that in my own lifetime I'm able to learn this and unlearn what I've been taught, and to be able to help to make change. And of course it's difficult, but it's young people that I see all around me doing the work. You talked about the work, but it's a lot of the young people who have inspired me to kind of need to keep going, need to make that space, need to be out there. And therefore, if I need to be out, and say, I'm neurodivergent, etc. So what? I can afford it.
I think that's really interesting. But I also think that in a way the work can be done in different spaces, right?
Absolutely.
There's work that is being done very frontline and out there and very present. But I think also of Clare, you attending to what's in the basement, what's easily forgotten, right? And can you tell us a little bit about why that inspired you? Like why the basement, and why looking at this story that was lesser known? Why
Basement is
because the older lady that was.
Yes. So this is also in relation to what we have been discussing so far. That is identity and representation, and how to see ourselves coming from further afield in a place like here. And I think it ultimately comes down to, at the individual level, how to represent oneself. So in my two films, we just watched the trailer of the second film that I made at Harwood House. The first film I made inside the Royal Pavilion, Brighton, because the interior is all chinoiserie. So again, my cast, the Chinese side of my cast is the same. Qianlong the Emperor, and my neighbor from downstairs, and myself, and then the reason for using three of us to represent the Chinese side, so to speak, and I must emphasize this gesture, the Chinese side, is because I want to diversify this Chineseness or this Chinese other in the theater of English chinoiserie, but judging from a colonial, post-colonial, or pre-colonial context. So Chineseness or Chinese motif was supposed to play this role of an other in chinoiserie, to be exotic and to represent the faraway world beyond reachable by East India Company, but ordinary people or upper class people didn't really get to travel, so they wanted to see something exotic at a close range at home, to imagine what kind of the world out there that their empire had access to. So how to deal with this problematic Chinese other as cultural or ethnic Chinese self. So I thought, rather than duplicating or confirming this self and other relationship, I can break it, I can deconstruct it by diversifying this other. So in this context, Chinese self is actually Chinese selves. There are multiple of us. And I use Qianlong because he was from the heyday of the Qing dynasty, and there's also when English chinoiserie was very popular in the 18th century. I believe that he was in power in China for 60 years, so it was across the 18th century. And of course, he was Manchurian, but he was the Manchurian emperor that revived, developed, and cherished Chinese arts, literature, poetry, philosophy so much. So there's some kind of ambivalence there. Technically, he's not ethnically Chinese, but he's actually more Chinese than Chinese people, or his Chinese subjects, in a sense. And it was in his reign that the so-called Middle Kingdom reached the peak, the highest peak. But then that's also when the peak started to break. And then to have Anne as the second character is also very intricate, because for her, she was Chinese, she was also Manchurian, and in fact, royal Chinese Manchurian. But she was, of course, a Taiwanese, because we were in Taiwan, she was downstairs. So what was she, and what am I, and what are we, coming from China, but then not really recognized as Chinese in China. But then that was my grandparents' generation. I was born and bred in Taiwan, but then my oral history and family lived experience all in this faraway land that I had never visited until actually not long ago, but I made a work about it. which
I love this retelling of this story because it really makes me think of that question that the Professor Ming Tianpo, who's an art historian, she gave this really wonderful paper that was also published recently where she asked the question, what is radicality? What is radical? And I think there's been a lot of thinking about radicality as always being the avant-garde, at the forefront. But she said that the root of the word radical is that it actually Latin, radici, which actually means the root. So it's actually digging deep. So I think back to all these things that you've been talking about, going down to the basement, finding that biodiversity. And in biodiversity, we see how actually everything is entangled, right? Or the trees have a wonderful root ecosystem and network.
There's no essentialism.
Yes, everything is entangled. And these stories of lineage and futures must be also entangled. And so in some way, it's not about representation as isolated blocks, but how everything is relationally entangled. So I think that's so beautiful, and it's such a reminder, like when we're, I suppose, trying to enact practice, how can that happen, So I just want to also give a shout out to Yin and Yali because they created this lovely board game this afternoon, which was incredibly relational because it had events that happened, it had stories and characters who had to rely on friends or live on the street, So it also reminded like how when friends didn't have money because they were gambling, their character, they had to borrow money from friends, But how much of this interpersonal relationship plays out across the stretch of history as well, right? Like of events beyond their control. So I just that really, I suppose, resonates so much in terms of how we've been struggling with terms like community and solidarity. And I have so much more to say as well about the parallel of investigating what Asian solidarity might look like here alongside everything that was unfolding with Black Lives Matter and sort of global tensions. But maybe I'll just pause there for a second. I just wonder if, because we're such an intimate space, please feel free to interject if you have a question or a comment or for any of our panelists. Otherwise, I'm happy to keep talking. Does anyone have a question or something they would like to say? Or maybe you are formulating your thoughts and would like to jump in at some point? I think for me, like the whole question around Black Lives Matter was really interesting and so difficult because clearly what happened after George Floyd, there was such a sense of solidarity with the untenable brutality against Black bodies in the US, which also then collided with the way we use the term blackness in the UK in terms of theory, right? Like political blackness, they were not commiserate with each other. And also then, how does that unfold when we have had like the spike of anti-Asian violence that was very palpable across the pandemic? And how does all that sit together? Because then you've got, these various cases of violence against Asian women, unfortunately, politically troubling, perpetrated by Black men in the US. But then you also got violence against Black people by Asian minorities. And so there's something terrible happening because we've got this ongoing need to dismantle white supremacy, but inter-community we can't seem to bridge easily. And maybe you can tell us more about how that worked or didn't work for you.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. But I also think that, who is it who talked about the imperialist mindset? Who is it? It must be Bell Hooks or one of them who talks about like how we inherit those systems of oppression ourselves in terms of our education, in terms of the institutions we work on, and then how we kind of reenact and reproduce those violences. I mean, that kind of minority on minority violence, I think is just a symptom of that. It's part of that. And now with the notion of culture wars, that surprise, surprise. No, not surprise, surprise. That's not the right term. I mean, currently, the people in charge, I know this is being recorded, and of course, Monday is coronation. And I'm just about to try to formulate a sentence that will get... I never know what comes out of my mouth, but I guess what I'm trying to... I forgot. Okay, so now we have people in charge in the UK who are actually children of migrants, right? But they have inherited so much of that systemic kind of violence that they're going out of their way to prove, yeah, we're part of the club. We're so much part of the club. And we're going to show that by doubling down. So instead of saying, oh, we're actually going to help our kind, no, we're going to show how white we are. Because we're more white than white. And the way I think about it is, you know, when you're evangelical, when you've just joined a cult or a religion, you're evangelical. You need to prove your stripes, right? You need to, like, yeah, I'm in. You need to be more than what the requirement is. And that's kind of how I see it. And the way they're talking about, oh, all these woke people, what's the word, tofuarati? I love tofu. I was so offended by that one. Tofu is flavoursome. So when they use those terms, because that will help them to strengthen their position, it's to incite violence within. It's to make people who are woke not going to be strong as a group. So that's kind of how I see it. And yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sorry. There's no pressure to resolve that.
No, and it's difficult. And yeah, I lost my train of thought.
I think one of the things I've also noticed is that even in the cultural sector, when we try to reach across different communities, it's not always easy because funding comes with certain frameworks, right? So is this for black artists? So therefore there will be programming around black artists. So similarly, we have also the danger of, like, is this for Chinese artists? Is this for Asian artists? Who's funding it, right? And so the funding sometimes dictates what we can do. And there seems to be funding streams that have this focus at the moment.
Well, it's an interesting one. I want to just say a quick one. Positive discrimination or positive policies can be productive. However, and that's also why I want to bring back to the discussion of leadership. We need people at the top to not make these kind of really box ticking exercises, like, oh, we need to have this, and to have a much more relational approach. We need people to be embedded in power, etc., to make that kind of decision, to be able to say, no, it's not just about having artists out there, it's about the entire sector, it's about institutions being much more leaky, and to have those gatekeepers changed. Because that's the sort of decisions that the kind of the same gatekeepers would keep coming up with. Oh, okay, that's how culture works. Okay, we're going to reinforce those kind of labels by saying, okay, this is how, you know, if you have certain percentage, whatever, of, you know, you have black artists, etc., then you get that money, or, you know, whatever. But it doesn't change anything because it's the same old, and you just get, you know, you're just, yeah.
I'm thinking if there's a linear, like from one end to one end spectrum of kind of the colonial project of violence against its subject, I see myself as working on the delicate end. So I'm working with representation, even historical one, using imagination. But I think it's important to inject narratives in society, in environment, in our dialogues, in our imagination, in our situations, and then I think art and culture is a very good medium in this sense. We can create our own perspectives and narratives, and then spread them further, and then people can receive them, and then perhaps inspire them to have their own narratives and perspectives, and then I think it might be a ripple effect in the long term.
Really?
I was going to say that what you've done about Chun-yu actually like links to like soul nowadays in the UK. Like the biggest soul artists in the UK that like go global are white British people, even though there's plenty of like people who aren't white. I like soul music coming from that black identity, but it's kind of like that repurposing of like white people taking something, but and like how they see it through their lens. So I guess soul music today was Chun-yu for people in the
Yes, it's also like
it's the same thing.
Yeah, it's also like Inca Shoni Barra's practice of working with these African, very bright colored African fabrics.
Wax fabrics.
They were, I think, made in Indonesia. It's an extension of batik, but made by the Europeans to sell to Africa as this kind of triangular trade system. But then the bright colored fabric has become such a symbol of Africanness. Yeah, so this kind of logic does happen here and there across time and space, but in this contemporary time, in this post-colonial time, we can respond to such phenomenon, and then have our own responses. Yeah, in various ways.
I want to make some response to what Kai was saying about leadership, and then how these people are gatekeeper, and that the way how they are functioning at the moment. It's performative. My personal experience, like, I understand exactly what you were saying, and that's my goal, to become a curator from an artist, to make changes, like actual institutional or structural change. But these people who are in senior management leadership, they don't allow someone like me who is radical and vocal to make the changes, and instead they just perform whiteness and without any sort of self-awareness. I think doing sort of the work called decolonization, it's important for a self perspective. Like, these people don't do self-decolonization, then how are you going? As Clare was also saying, it's not just like external, but it's also very important. It's about internal. So that this is the reason why I feel like why we understand we're talking about all of this idea or concept or theory or methodologies. It's not only because we're part of the group that being oppressed, but at the same time, I think it comes from our very ancestral thinking of Taoism, where everything is interconnected, and it cherish about your own, what do you call it, self-cultivation. There's no such concept in a British colonial sort of mentality. The British colonial mentality, or settlers or white colonizers, are all about entitlement. You just take. You don't need to ask. Like that's how. So how is it these people can change with us rather than us doing the work in this complete separate direction? And all of this institution learned the language of diversity, inclusion, blah blah blah. But are they actually practicing that? When someone like myself challenge them, shake their bolt, all they do is trying to brush me off, like, you're a troublemaker, go away. And then they still get the funding about doing decolonization work.
Call them out.
Oh, I have.
As loudly as possible.
Oh, I have. I have. And another thing that I'm noticing also is interesting. I have based in Scotland for 6 years, and recently I live in Liverpool for the past two-ish years, and felt there's a huge gap of Scottish-based artists or Scottish creative practitioner, and in England there's a huge gap. Nobody knows about Blue Coat in Scotland. In Blue Coat, nobody knows about things in Scotland. So there's like, how do I say it? We're living in the same country, and then all of this sort of separation from this different art community is huge. And I'm still noticing and have a feeling, even though I moved to Liverpool, I still notice and have a strong feeling to witness London-centric community, and I don't like this gap or isolation, as if I don't even exist in the sort of London art world or just general England art world, but I've been practicing for years. So just
Yeah.
some feedback.
Don't lose hope.
I think you're realizing what I think a lot of people like that frustration is the fact that, like, I think it comes to kind of like once I think there's like that thing where if you start entering and you're from like a class background, so if you want to kind of like improve it for where you are, and then once you kind of move up the rungs, then you kind of know. So there's like that weird in-between space where you're still figuring out what happens somewhere else and what happens in your own place, in your own space. But you've got to work so hard to enter your own art space because the doors are closed. Then you have to understand what's happening in your own space. And then you've got to wait a few more years to slowly figure out what's happening in other spaces, because the interconnection of like the UK is so bad. Like, you look at the infrastructure, like, why does it take so long to get to Newcastle? And Newcastle is closer to Manchester than London is, but it's like almost twice the journey time. Like, why is it so hard to get between Hull and Newcastle from Manchester or Liverpool? Why is it so hard to get between Manchester and Liverpool? I work in Liverpool, I live in Manchester. Like, but that also comes on this back to this map, like, you're like, and then I think for a lot of, like, I don't know, it depends on where you come from and your background, but like Scotland feels so far away, and I think to a lot of people, because you're trying to figure out what happens in your area, and if you don't have someone to guide you in like that space of what is happening art-wise, and art is so broad, then you're like, okay, right, now I've spent 5 years trying to figure out what's happening in this one area, say like the Manchester, Greater Manchester area, and practicing. And then you might move to another area and you've got to figure out what's happening in there. So, but then you're having to also learn what's happening nationally, like, and if you don't have a guide, then you're not going to know. And I think that's what you're realizing is there's no...
That's the work of a curator, not the work of artists. The curator should be doing the work to research the artist.
If you're not from a background where like people understand art, I say understand art, or work in the art, you don't know anything. And art school like doesn't always help, and you're like you can try and get your foot in through like volunteering or through an entry-level job or like through like talking to people, but that's a lot of time. You've also got to pay bills. You've also got to like go and work another job, and there's so many obstacles if you don't already know that. And then obviously, like you're saying, it's the job of a curator to then promote that. But like you're saying, like not all curators travel to other places and say, you know what, I really want to have a look at what you're doing, because the people don't always agree what someone's doing in another area. So a curator might know what's going on outside of like one city, but if they're not interested, if they don't think that will build on their practice, then they're not going to. So they're not going to tell the other people that are looking to them for that knowledge, because they don't think that it's beneficial to them. Maybe that
I'm a bit confused.
Okay. Maybe what I'm hearing is also that there are some ongoing problems, right? So I think although we're trying to navigate or shift beyond the question of just representation alone to the relational practice, to thinking through entanglement, because we need to bridge communities, we need to bridge between diasporas, right? But I think what I'm also hearing from you guys is that to even do the work, there's a struggle first to even survive in the sector, whether it's trying to get a job in an institution or to be heard in an institution, or to have programs or opportunities that help you navigate the professional part of it, to even want to do the work that you do, right? So it's like, how do you even do that kind of work when you're even just trying to get the job, right? Like, yeah.
I think what I was trying to say was not on an individual, but as an institutional power that they don't link or collaborate, or like it's completely...
It's a very siloed approach, right? Like
it's disconnecting, it's an intentional tactic of separation or like dividing.
You're also, but they have to compete for funding. That's one thing, but also you have to question, does the curator or do curators in certain institutions or independently, are they interested in each other? So like, for example, an X-curator might not be interested in Y curator's work. They might be interested, who is in the same, say in England, two curators might be interested in each other. They both might be interested in international people. So like, they're going to be working to make links on something that interests them internationally rather than something that rather than making connections nationally together. It's frustrating.
You reminded me what you were saying. What you were saying.
So just, sorry, I'm just going to pause you both because I think we could go on with this, but I saw a hand. No, we'll loop back. Yeah, but go ahead.
I'm trying to kind of sort of try to do some active listening and reflecting on my experience. I've been working in art for about 30 years, starting from trying to be an artist and kind of doing some of the connectedness that we all want to do. And I think the art-led scene is very good in that, because you're part of a studio, you kind of go visit another studio, you kind of get to know the scene in another place, including London, which I agree is a very different place to Manchester, where I really learn how to be an artist and how to learn how to project manage and develop projects with other people. But my point, my observation is that I've been working in the arts for a long time in galleries, and now for Factory International, which is a new name for Manchester International Festival. And my observation is that the arts have been instrumentalized so much that it's very business-like. Even universities, everything is so ring-fenced. So as much as we can try to decategorize ourselves, and I mean, another word for it, 30 years ago I was using words like pigeonhole. Don't pigeonhole us, kind of thing. It's different terminologies for different times. But I think the business of universities, business of Arts Council and local authorities is so much that organisations who get a little bit of funding here and there from universities, local authorities, art trusts and foundations, they're so instrumentalised that it's quite hard to have that freedom of maybe research. And maybe I'm not saying 30 years ago it was actually brilliant. It wasn't actually. But I think that's a different strategy that I think people are using. So I quite like the strategy of disrupting, even within an institution. I always thought that. As a young person back then, thinking, what can I do to get around the table? Because I was thinking, I'm not around the table around anything, decision making. I became a bit of a decision maker, but even then, I used to go to Arts Council meetings with other funded organisations, and you put your hand up and you're kind of representing the independent arts scene, and the big organisations will always have an answer for why the artists run or artists developed activism, almost, are not being funded, or why certain things are more important than others, usually about how much broader appeal, wider reach, all those things. So in a way, I suppose I haven't got any answers, but my observation is that the way to connect is to try to find ways outside of those systems and using the resources of the systems to try to do that. And art is a very good thing to do. I still believe that arts are so good at thinking about other strategies of doing things. So I think, I agree with you that things are not as connected, but actually, I think it goes in waves. I think there's certain times when you think, okay, there's certain movements that are now happening, a bit like mycelium, to go with your analogy of connectedness kind of thing. I think it's the artists and the grassroots curators who connect rather than institutions. I really believe that institutions are so bogged down in their agendas that they have to sign up to for the funding agreement that it's quite hard for them to manoeuvre. I think it's the individuals who can make those changes, but keep going.
But on the...
I am doing the bridge of Scotland and Liverpool. Also, Scotland is not that far, 4 hours train.
I know.
But on the positive...
It should be faster, That's what my argument is.
On the positive note, I think this is what we're doing, because AAA used to be based in Riven Row in London. I think many members of yours are London-based. You are here in a conversation with us, and people like you, Catherine, you are based in Liverpool. You came over today, so we are mingling with each other. We are breaking the boundary of this kind of micro-geographical kind of war. Yeah, but there's also, thanks to Easy Contemporaries incorporation of it in the show and so forth. So this is happening, and we should do more of this here and there.
Yeah. And I like. Yeah. And no, I agree. And I use the term artfulness, like being crafty and trying to play the system or play havoc with the system, use the system, because we are part of the system. And that's why I like what you're saying about getting the funding and then doing your own thing, and that's also why you need to have the language to get that funding.
In the first place.
Well, but it is. The system is. I don't know who said it, but the system is hacked, right? It's hacked. It's not just. It's socially unjust. It's unjust. So how you need to play the system to get what you need doing, and that's also why a lot of us you frame your work also in education, because you also teach in universities as well. That's also why we know that it's not an overnight kind of change, and that's why I talk about young people, no pressure. And then that's also why a lot of us are involved in education and higher education, etc. It's about shifting those minds, changing the syllabus, decolonizing the syllabus, bringing people like our peers into the university system to say, look, this is important, not just the dead white men, etc. So it's a slow process to undo a lot of those structural kind of harm that's been kind of instituted for so long. So it takes time.
And just speaking of time, I think we're almost there, right? Yeah. I just wanted to also end just with a couple, two thoughts from this wonderful exchange. Thank you everyone for being so vulnerable and so present and sharing. I think one thing that really comes to mind is what you're saying about the connectedness, right? How we connect. And it makes me think about how interesting it is that trees sometimes will continue to funnel nutrients to a tree that's been chopped. It's just a stump, but it continues to feel it. And it's really interesting because that tree still has a root network, right? And actually the way trees communicate of oncoming disasters or weather changes is through what they can tell in the ground and what they can tell above. Mm-hmm. So even the tree that looks like it's already dead and chopped still has some use to its community. So I thought that was really beautiful as a kind of I don't know, maybe because I'm getting older, I'm identifying with that tree. Maybe. The other thing also that I think is interesting
specifically a stump.
Don't push it down. But the other thing also that's really funny about connectedness is that it has to be reciprocal, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, because otherwise there's a blood transfusion and it's extractive, right? So when we are energized, it is because it's mutual and it continues to circulate, and that's where it stays friend. And I think that's something that I really learned through some of the pain of community work, is that sometimes you want to share, but you have to also learn to receive. And through receiving, you also learn to trust, right? So it is about the circulation and looking for the preciousness of those relationships that aren't just about extraction, but are also wanting to give. And those ones you can hopefully nurture for a while. And I think the other thing that also then I realized through different storytelling, and I hope this is a bit of hope, is that sometimes within the very fearsome, nasty institutions, you also have hidden agents, and maybe they'll reveal themselves in time, and when they do, then it's really interesting how they can operate within those systems. So I know of a curator who works for a very prominent institution who somehow knows how to funnel things from the budgets to pay things that shouldn't get paid, and they do that, at the risk of their own job. So this kind of redistribution within the structure also happens. So I think I'm also trying to learn how not to see things as monolithic, like not all Asian people are necessarily the ones I want to work with if they're not reciprocal, but not necessarily all white people are, you know, part of like the white supremacist system either. You know, we have to form much more interconnectedness beyond just our immediate community. Yeah, I think that's something that I really kind of have come to realize. But thank you so much for being so generous. Thank you all for thank you for really chiming in, and thank you so much, Dot, for holding this space for us.
And thank you, Annie, for holding the space and allowing us to share our vulnerabilities. So thank you.
And thank you for the book. I think we have got quite a few copies.
Please, if you have the funds, please do support. And it's actually we've been very lucky. We've had some amazing support. So I just want to let you know that we're also down to the last 20 to 30 copies because it had to be a limited run because we didn't have a lot of funds. So if you do want to get your hands on one, now's a good opportunity. Thank you, ECA, for platforming it as well. Yeah.
Yay.
Cool.